Hello guys and welcome back to Lines of Battle. As you can see, there is a bunch of things going on this map. In fact, everything looks different. Only some of the units look the same, but look at the trees, on the color of the grass it looks more yellow. But overall the map just looks so much more prettier. At first I believed this to be only a texture change, but actually the objects themselves on the map has changed as well, but I will not get into that right now. I will talk about it when we get to the scenario editor, but right now I will talk about what in the world is the star in the middle for, and why was an update dropped without any changelog. Actually, I'm not really aware. I think that it may have been released as a result of a mistake, like as it happened last time when the new update was released a couple hours before. And in fact, there are also quite some bugs. Not major ones, but they are some bugs. But anyways, what is that star good for? Now, this star was added as a victory point in an attempt to try to counter campers. The idea behind this was that if you introduce a star in the middle of the map, then campers couldn't just hold one position. They would be forced to at least at some point engage with the center of the map. And well, that is true to some degree. However, capturing stars or victory points is still not a major thing. In fact, if you are at a disadvantage in victory points, you still only get a little bit of a debuff for every round. And so I would still say that not going directly for the stars is still very much reasonable when you pretty much have just anything else going on in the game. In fact, I will get into it, but professional players do agree based on their games. Now currently we have one neutral star at the beginning, but there are plans to introduce as much as 4 more, so in total about 5 stars in the middle. I believe that this first one is just for experimentation, and based on how well the game works with just a single star, they will decide if they want to add maybe 2 more or maybe even 4 more. We will see. But more strikingly, there are 2 new units in the game. One of them is right down there. It looks very similar to the guard unit. However, it is not other than the grenadier. It is really similar to the guard, not only in texture, but also in some of the stats. In fact, they actually deal a little more melee damage. Plus, they seem to have a little bit of a larger charge bonus as well. Furthermore, they do have a weaker range damage and a weaker melee defense. And they are also in an organization disadvantage, with just barely having more organization than a regular infantry does. We will see this new unit get used in just a minute. But first of all, there is also another unit in the game that just got added. However, it is not being used that commonly so far. It is the 4 pound-foot artillery. It isn't really strong. I guess it still shoots to a reasonable distance. And it also has a quite decent movement speed, but it's just not that practical compared to some other artillery units. And as a result, on this stage in the game, you won't really see many players using it. And after we appreciated this map for a bit longer and how well it looks, let's just go over and read the actual description on these new units. The Grenadiers, let's see. These shock troops are made up the tallest, strongest and most imposing men of the line infantry, while they are generally more fearsome than the average line troops. Their most powerful option in combat is their devastating charge. And about the 8 pound-foot artillery, the lightest common field artillery of the Napoleonic Wars, with modest firepower and good mobility that make it a natural companion to the infantry. Okay, nothing really new here, although I wouldn't really keep them at my main infantry line, at least for right now, with these current unit stats. But that's kinda fine. Let's just ignore that. Ooh, look at this, we have some objective skins as well. The Russian Cross, Austria's Venus, Pour le Mérite, although is it really pronounced Mérite or Mérite? Anyhow, we also have the French Eagle and the Royal Crown. These look kinda nice, although my personal favorite has to be this one over here at the center. It just looks the coolest to me. Actually, you know what? There we go. Select. We also got an update to the look of the ECUs and the prestige. Now whenever you look into the shop, for example at the units, and let's look at the horse archer, you will not see ECU and prestige typed out, only their icons in the shop. Let's see if we have any new skins in the game. Not really, I believe, although we still have the tanks, which sound like a pretty decent investment. Anyhow, you know what is in the game though? Tournaments! Well, there isn't any yet, because people don't really want to spend their precious ECUs on random tournaments, but now we have them in the game, and not just only on the test server as previously. Now before looking at some of the meta changes, let's just take a deroute and look at the scenario editor. Because I was just looking through this, and then I have realized that there are a bit more terrain types than what I was used to. For example, look at shallow water, deep water, cliff, and bridge. Okay, now I have experience with this a little bit. I have drew up this beautiful map right over here just to test out some of the terrains and how they look. And actually, you cannot move into the deep water no matter how you try. For example, I could just like drag it onto the deep water, but once my unit gets there, it will not cross. It just ends the turn, and it shows to me that it would go this far in the next turn. But when I end my turn, it just puts me back right in place. So yeah, you cannot really move into the deep water or move inside the deep water either. It just don't really give me any options to move there. And then the same seems to be true for the cliff. I can't really move anywhere when I'm on the cliff. And we also have this very pretty bridge that I have no clue how it works, because for some reason there is a bug in the game right now, and each of the terrain just says land when you look at the unit informations. However, the game is surely aware of the terrain, because otherwise these terrains wouldn't be impassable, so it's probably just a display bug. Quick update, the display has been fixed. Whenever we look at the shallow water, for example, now we can see the modifiers. However, we don't really see any modifiers for the other new terrain types. And so is for the bridge. Now this is correct. Then it would mean that unlike for the road, you aren't actually any faster on the bridge, which could make sense in real life, to be fair. Anyways, back to the scenario editor. If you made any custom maps, you might have to remake them after this update, because previously, when you were just drawing up a river, let's say, let's just put down some very nice shallow waters as rivers, and you wanted to go diagonally, all you had to do was to put a new body of water right over here, and then if you just kept going, it would have made a connection on the diagonal. However, that got removed with the new update, and it was on purpose, dare I say. I'm saying this because for road generation, the same is also true, and whenever you load in an old map you will see the roads displayed like this, but whenever you create a new world, then the game will automatically create the roads something like this. Now you have to place down another road piece in order to connect these terrains like so. And the same is of course true for the water as well. Now for the bridge, you can just place them down on the river by themselves, and then they look like a strange little dot on the map. You could also just like make a road of bridges. I'm not sure if this has any effects on its own, or is it just the regular as a road would be. Actually, let's just try to like connect it up to roads if it works. It does actually work, but it looks kinda strange. So let's just reduce it back to what it's probably meant to look like so. And then we have a standard bridge. It does get weird though whenever you try to place down multiple bridges, or actually these look like ships on the river. That's amazing actually. I haven't really thought of that so far. But yeah, you can do up all these different shapes on the map. They look kinda funky and kinda weirdish, but for example, this looks like a cut out log. And of course, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the same weirdness happens for roads as well. Although some creative people have actually designed deserts using the white nature of the roads. So yeah, now let's have a quick mention of the changes of unit prices. Most notably, the price of cavalry has been changed in order to alter the meta. And I'm sure that just in a couple of days we will have some new meta builds available, but now let's just take a look at how some of these new units compare to each other. So actually the grenadiers cost the same gold as a simple line infantry, but they almost cost as many manpower as a guard will do. So yeah, that's interesting. I would assume that they would instead increase the gold requirement and decrease the manpower later on, just because it is a little weird when you think about how the grenadiers have such a low organization while they are supposed to be these big strong men, and they almost have as many men as the guards would do. So yeah, and so now let's just actually look into a game played by two amazing players, namely IMGK playing as a red, if I remember correctly. I believe so. Yeah, IMGK against Peanut over here. So let's take a look into it. IMGK plays as a red, Peanut is playing as a blue, and I'm not sure about the deployment of IMGK here. Now he is an amazing player, but I found it strange that he would place the strongest melee units in his army on the flanks. Why it is strange? Because if you want to commit your strongest units on the flank, then you basically allow the enemy to just move out of the way and form a line somewhere else. Or to make a different drawing on this, you have your strongest units over here, the rest of your army is right over here. The enemy would be probably more interested in shifting the battle on the left and include their strongest units somewhere over here, where they are much more harder to avoid. And this is exactly what we will see in this battle, as blue just moves out of the way of red's strongest units, and they line up for a battle on these plains in the center. Now, none of these players actually have any of the new 4-pounder foot artillery, because no one really likes them at this level of gameplay so far. Also, keep an eye out for how they are managing their victory points around the map, because it is going to be very important considering that both players are lining up for a very unusual vertical battle, because most battles take place horizontally, like so. And so now let's just continue watching this as both lines finally form up and IMGK takes control of this hill right over there, and now his enemy units are in the range for the artillery to start picking on something. And maybe now, as blue has stopped, red's infantry could actually have a chance to flank the enemy army from the side. At this point, I am going to point out a mistake made by the blue player over here. Actually, multiple of them. First of all, their artillery is just not on the front line quickly enough, and thus they can't really punish this all-out of charge made by red on the bottom. But if they were here, for example, or just down here even, they could have retaliated very much severely. Second mistake is that their guards are still very far away from the combat zone. And it is important because at the beginning, Red had a worse position by putting their most ferocious fighters on such an inactive position right over there. But now, Blue has mismanaged their development significantly enough that now they are just further away from the enemy than the enemy is from them. That was not supposed to happen, and it is not the winning play. Now, actually, third of all, these cavalries should really become more active, because if they could come over here and threaten the marching column of units, then Blue might be saved over there. So let's just see how this game plays out, and indeed those horses get moving, and Red just very barely gets into the capture zone of this victory point. But as I previously mentioned, professional players don't really care that much about victory points. In fact, they care much more about a good position than a chance to capture a victory point. And so just like so, they will immediately abandon it just to fall back close to it. Actually, no, they won't fall back, but they have abandoned it. And now they managed to send the cavalry on a route as well. Now, what Blue should have played, in my opinion, is to just diversify their cavalries, making them harder targets and more ferocious threats. Second of all, I see this big blob of not so useful guards over here that are very easy prey for artilleries should Red feel like firing at them. For example, this artillery could hit at least 3 of Blue's units if they aimed right. Oh, actually, let me just quickly talk about a new meta change in the game. So previously, if you were to just fire with your standard line infantry or any unit in the game, you were able to deal some massive damage on the enemy due to something called multi-shot or multi-damage or micro-damage, which basically meant that you were just able to create a shoot order, and as you shot through these individual units, you basically dealt full damage to each and every one of them. But with this new and sudden update, you are no longer able to do that. In fact, if I was to just create a fire order, I could only hit 2 of these infantries. And actually, let me just select the second one for a target, so you can see it better how most of the shots get absorbed by the first infantry, and you only deal a marginal damage to the second one. The same is true for artilleries. You can only damage the first 2 units starting from now on if you are dealing canister damage. Now, interestingly enough, whenever you are just still doing a regular fire order, you can still damage a lot more units, although seeing how this yellow line gets more and more transparent, I assume that units still absorb some of the firepower and you could only shoot 1 or 2 more units. In fact, yeah, you are only able to damage 4 units at a row at max, and you just cannot really shoot any further away because all the shots get absorbed by 4 lines of infantries. Now going back to the battle actually, let's just see how this continued. Blue actually goes in for the center, while they are delaying at the button. As I said, this is a standard play at intermediate and professional players. You want to delay the battle wherever you are weaker, and you want to initiate wherever you are stronger. In fact, now it's supposed to be IMGK's turn to fall back, and surely enough he does. And something interesting on the playstyle of these players is how Blue actually stops to capture the victory point, unlike IMGK. Now IMGK made a very tactical deployment over there, as he just looked at how far Blue's infantry has gotten on the left, and he was just like, okay, I will not chase you down that far. Instead, I will just go for this other part of the flank. And this is very significant because Blue essentially just disabled 4 of their units, while they are also taking massive casualties from this artillery down there on their most powerful units, the guards. In fact, blue on overall now seems to be outnumbered on the active front line itself. But without further ado, let's just continue watching this game. And we can see how blue just tries to very quickly redeploy some of their inactive troops, and they actually make IMGK retreat. But in the meanwhile, blue has managed to capture the victory point in the center. Now, if the situation was a stalemate for long, then blue would gradually gain victory points and eventually win the game, because unit organization lost is tied to the share of victory points and also to the acceleration of losing victory points. And if you want to look very close at this northern front, while blue's units are pretty low on organization, they do actually have something strong going on with these artilleries. It can be very powerful to have your artillery in the front line, because then you can just deal canister damage on your enemy. And furthermore, if blue is able to capture the third star on the map, then they could absolutely crush IMGK in a war of attrition in just a couple of turns, because the amount of ore that he would lose would become very significant over a couple of turns. But anyways, he would first have to win there. And he's not only outnumbered in the infantry, but also outmatched in the cavalry over there. His only advantage is the artilleries right there. Also, by the way, talking about artilleries, one of the reasons why red withdrew down here is not only being outnumbered, but also being forced into an enfilade position by this artillery over here. Now this is a must in this position. I would also do it whenever you are facing a fundamentally stronger but temporarily weaker enemy. It is always great to give them a chase and just put them in a very hard position, give them some very hard time. In fact, red now also has the cavalry to aid them in the destruction of blue's troops, and we can see how they get closer and closer to routing their force. However, they just don't really have quite the resources at hand, and blue's cavalry is able to get there just in time. And yet, blue is still outnumbered on the north, and red is now confident enough to go into a big assault on the front. Now blue has indeed been picking on some of these weakened red units in the back ranks, and now they are all routing. However, now they are deep behind enemy lines, and not in a good sense, because red also has their own cavalry in the nearby, actually over here as well, separating blue's units from the main front of action over there. This would not be a problem, because blue could just chase down the routing units and building a long-term lead. However, might I just remind you that blue might just be outnumbered down there, for at this moment they may have the numbers, but they do not have the orc. Just look at these two units about to break. Blue will soon be absolutely outnumbered without a doubt. Now you can keep watching this and you can see how both of these units actually break. And this puts red into a position of attack. In the meanwhile, they also managed to break down some of blue's cavalry by attacking them whenever they were far away from each other. But enough of talking, let's just see the end of this match. Red slowly commits to the destruction of the artilleries, but the first two of their attempts have failed. The third one almost failed as well, but with the 4th infantry, they managed to finally carry it over. And overall, despite losing 2 infantries in the siege of the artilleries themselves, red was able to create an advantage in cavalry and firepower significant enough that they have managed to win the game and force their enemy to resign. And these were some of the most important changes in this update, although you might hear some more from me whenever we get the actual official changelog coming out, which could happen later today or in the coming days, we will see. But until then, you may want to check this out.